As we've previously discussed, you can never appease narcissists, and there's no amount of appeasement or acquiescing to COVID mandates that will satisfy the bully boy elites in charge of your country. If you keep playing along with their demands, you can expect more demands. It all comes to a halt when you refuse to comply. Many people believe that after the vaccine, life will just return to normal. I've been saying for quite a while now, normality was never supposed to return, and that an entirely new dystopian normal was being created through fear, coercion, and the slow boiling frog effect, where people are gradually acclimatized over time through prolonged exposure and adaptation to a new way of living. People actually believed that if they did what they were told by the government and the media, like good little children, then one day they wouldn't have to wear face masks and do social distancing anymore.
Once the process is complete, does that mean they can take off their masks? They don't have to social distance? They can just go about their lives as before?
I would recommend that that's not the case. I would recommend you have an added area of protection. Obviously, with a 90+% effective vaccine, you could feel much more confident. But I would recommend to people to not abandon all public health measures just because you've been vaccinated, because even though for the general population it might be 90 to 95% effective, you don't necessarily know for you how effective it is. So when I get vaccinated, which I hope to when it becomes my turn to get vaccinated, I'm not going to abandon completely public health measures. I could feel more relaxed and essentially not having the stringency of it that we have right now. But I think abandoning it completely would not be a good idea.
Because 5 to 10% of the people that get immunized, it will not be effective for. So they might actually get the virus if they just completely let down their guard. Okay, that's interesting.
So there you have it. Social distancing and masks are supposed to continue forever, apparently. How did humanity ever exist prior to the implementation of these stringent and totally unnatural and anti-human public health measures? Now, recently, Professor Luke O'Neill spoke to a group of school children.
The vaccine will at least drop the R naught by 0.8, 0.9, okay? So now we're down to 0.2, which is incredible, really. That means it takes 10 people to infect 2. In that situation, you're almost back to normal. And if the R naught is down at 0.2, 0.1, nobody has to wear masks. Nobody has to worry about distancing, right? That's the ultimate goal here. We will get there eventually. The only question is how long is it going to take and how widespread is the coverage of the vaccine. So I would predict by next summer, if 50% are vaccinated, and we know the vaccine is working gangbusters, we could well see no need for masks in school at all because the risk of infection is a lot lower, So that's the way to think of it. It's a decreasing of risk all the time. And then as the risk gets lower, there's no need to observe things because you've got a low risk of getting infected. Like, let me give you one more example. Imagine we vaccinate all the nursing homes. All those people they have a 95% decreased risk of getting infected. Of course, we can visit them again. Of course, they can come out of the nursing homes and visit us because the risk is so low that they're going to get infected. Now, in that time, though, in the next 6 months already, we keep wearing the masks. We keep distancing because we haven't got full coverage, and it'll be sensible to keep observing, all difficult though they are. We may wear masks every winter. Remember, you never know because it's not that difficult. Now not in schools, but in shops and so on, like you see in China, for instance. So we may observe some of these things into the future, and so I think it's going to be what we call vaccines plus, and that means keep doing what you're doing and vaccinate certainly for 6 months.
So was that clear? Kind of. Even if you're vaccinated, you probably will have to wear your mask and social distance for 6 months until some R number thing comes down, but you still might have to wear masks in shops every winter. Okay, yeah, that was clear, right? Sure.
I mean, what they're discussing at the moment is the passport idea. So in other words, if you're vaccinated, you're now free of infection, of course, and secondly, you will not spread the infection. You might have a thing on your iPhone, it says I've been vaccinated. You might have a wristband that you can't get off. The risk with iPhones is you give it to your friend and they get into the thing. So there may be wristbands that can't come off. That's one thing. Now that could be people that, I'm not on my wrist. There'll be civil liberty questions there. But those kinds of things are being considered now. Certainly some indication that you've been vaccinated. Now I think you should wear it as a badge of honor. I've taken the vaccine for the vulnerable, remember, So I think we may see that coming out. And then maybe you might have a situation where you can only go to your jabs if you're vaccinated. And I bet you'll take a vaccine to get to your devs probably.
Unbelievable. So he talks about the Health Passport app to prove that you're vaccinated, which is basically show me your papers, please. And he talked about a wristband alternative, a wristband that can't come off. And then he makes some remark about how people will complain about their civil liberties. No shit! Considering a person's right to free movement will be infringed upon because if they refuse to take an unnecessary and experimental vaccine, I would imagine there will be quite a few people complaining about their fundamental human rights. It's unbelievable, but I have been talking about this crap for months now, and it seems that some of our worst concerns with respect to rising authoritarianism are actually on the horizon here. Luke O'Neill also says that students may not be able to go to their DEBs, for those of you in America, that's the prom here in Ireland, if they aren't vaccinated. Luke was then asked if a booster shot of the vaccine would be needed.
That's another unknown. We know that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine had a booster. Now, this makes sense because your first hit wakes up the immune system. The second hit gets it going usually. It's a bit like the first hit's the alarm clock going off. The second hit is the shower, and you feel energized. So you do, that's a good analogy. I just made it up for you guys. Yeah, at the moment, it's a 2-shot protocol, we call it, right? Now, the next question then is, will that protect you for how long? And we don't know. I'd be optimistic. I mean, the worst case scenario here is once a year. Now, I know that's like the flu vaccine in a way, but we can live with that. We can live with a once-a-year vaccine, couldn't we, if we're all back to normal?
So there you have it. You thought your life was going back to normal if you just surrendered all your rights, freedoms, and bodily sovereignty for however long the lying government demanded it. Well, it depends what you mean by normal. If by normal we mean the mandates and control measures will largely remain in place and everyone has to be vaccinated every year, then yeah, I guess it's normal, right?
On the more positive side, it could be for longer. We just got to watch it. This is like a big scientific experiment in many ways. We're going to watch it closely. And I remember there are 6 other vaccines in their phase 3 trials as we speak. One will report before Christmas, the AstraZeneca vaccine. And then there's another 5 coming up behind. They will be reading out in March, April, May next year. Now, can you imagine if we've 8 vaccines showing efficacy? Now, some of them might be a one-shot vaccine. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that's a one-shot one. You don't need 2. So we'll see. You may end up with a vaccine that just needs 1 shot that might give protection for a year or maybe even more. So again, it's one to watch. The way this virus is, though, what we know about it, I would predict every year probably is a likely scenario.
Whatever happened to the human immune system? Seriously, did it just stop working in 2020 or something? What did we do before the pharmaceutical industry came along?
It's even aggravated by the question about the vaccine itself. We don't know yet, for example, is 1 dose sufficient? Do you need 2 doses? In what interval? Do you have even to be vaccinated every year? Because the antibodies may not sustain for a long time.
Let's move on. This article is from the Daily Mail. Britons who test negative for COVID twice in a week are set to receive a freedom pass under government scheme that will allow them to live a normal life. So if you have to get a freedom pass, it means that you're not free, and they're admitting that you're currently not free, okay? So that's not a free society. A hall pass for life, basically. A hall pass to live your life. It is hoped the scheme could allow Britons to go back to a relatively normal life, relatively meaning not normal. To earn a freedom pass, people will need to get a negative test twice a week. How far away are we from the Hunger Games at this stage? Pass will allow you to mix with friends and family without distancing or masks. Again, this has been made possible by the fact that the general public were so utterly terrified, traumatized, and bamboozled by fear-mongering for so many months that they actually started to believe that their rights and freedoms come from the government, when in fact they don't. They're inalienable. So the government takes everyone's fundamental rights away, and then, in order to get the public to comply with the new abnormal, they tease them by offering to give them back tiny little bits of scraps of their freedom. You know, they're kind of bribing them. And the public, being so desperate for a reprieve from all of these oppressive measures, might actually see such freedom passes as a way out. You can see where this is leading people. They are slowly being conditioned to accept having to negotiate for the right to do things that they previously understood to be indisputable freedoms that the government couldn't touch. They just took them for granted. Now they're basically being told to ask the government for permission to just spend time with their friends and family, or being allowed to just forgo social distancing or masks for a little while. The general adult population, globally at this stage, appears to have been reduced to an infantilized state, like children having to ask if it's okay for them to hug their grandkids or visit their neighbor. Perfectly healthy people are being told that they're sick due to a highly questionable PCR test, all the while actual sick people who are in need of hospital care are being denied that care. They're being denied their necessary treatments. COVID-19, the virus so deadly, you have to be tested to know you have it, as the meme goes. And this argument that asymptomatic carriers, which is to say healthy people, could get someone sick is the most outrageous premise, because it's basically a recipe for permanent lockdowns and restrictions. If the government, with their so-called expert scientists, can simply call a pandemic at any time and then claim that people who feel healthy are potentially sick with a deadly virus that could get some vulnerable person killed somewhere, then it's essentially the perfect excuse to rob everyone of their rights and freedoms at any time and forever. The reality is, this is not how a society that values individual civil liberties functions, because the burden of proof must fall on the person making the claim about the deadly virus, and they must prove that the health recommendations are proportionate to the level of the danger. Even then, I would only accept any health measures as recommendations, as advisory, and not mandatory, even in a serious outbreak. And I know some of you disagree with me on that, but you got to understand the price of freedom is simply too high. And you can't just trust that even after a genuine pandemic, that your government is going to just give your rights back to you. That's very naive, and that's what people have done in this case. Now, under the Spanish flu, when people were living in an actual pandemic, there was evidence all around them of this sickness. Everybody knew someone who died from it, or at least had been sick from it. You know, you could see examples of sickness in the streets. Not so much with COVID, right? The article continues. To earn the Freedom Pass, people will need to be tested regularly, and provided the results come back negative, they will then be given a letter, card, or document they can show to people as they move around. Oh, boy. The certificate would be stored on a phone. I just want to point out, I said this stuff months ago. I was called a conspiracy theorist. It's happening, so, you know. The certificate would be stored on a phone, according to sources, and will allow people to live a relatively normal life until the government's vaccination program gets up to speed. So there you go. Next up, the vaccine. It would even allow Britons to get away without wearing a mask, it is thought, and visit family and friends without the need to socially distance. Freedoms and rights we previously took for granted, now coming with qualifiers and conditions, even in your own home. Right? It's like the public are all prisoners being temporarily released under bail conditions. A source told The Telegraph they will allow someone to wander down the streets, and if someone else asks why they are not wearing a mask, they can show the card, letter, or an app. I preferred life before, when you could just walk around freely and you didn't have to show anything to anybody. In other words, people have to show their papers, right? Show me your papers, please. This is leading to mass medication of the populace by state coercion. What could possibly go wrong? This same strategy will be used for the vaccine. It almost makes you wonder why they're pushing the vaccine so much. I wonder what's in it. The government will not concede any liberties to you until you conform to their medical tyranny. The governments of this world are merely puppets of the globalist interests in the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, Big Pharma, and they are at war with humanity. This Fox News article talks about Greece. Coronavirus lockdown in Greece requires people to text authorities before leaving home. Under a second nationwide coronavirus lockdown in Greece, people will need to text authorities if they want to leave their homes. The lockdown will start at daybreak Saturday and last until the end of the month, with infections surging across the country. Prime Minister, let me see if I can pronounce this, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, probably not pronouncing that correctly, said he acted before patients overwhelm hospitals. Where have we heard that before? Oh yeah, for the last 8 months, all the time. We must stop this wave, he said Thursday. I chose once again to take drastic measures sooner rather than later, As part of the lockdown, all retail stores, except those selling essential items such as food, medication, and fuel, will be closed. Travel inside the country will be severely restricted. People will only be allowed to leave their homes for work, physical exercise, or medical reasons, and only after sending a text message to authorities. In the texts to the 5-digit number, people will have to provide their name, address, and the reason why they need to leave their home. Unreal. Where is the outrage? Honestly, like, what is wrong with... No, does anybody value freedom anymore? Except, a handful of us at this point. Moving on, Dan Price tweeted the following. Wealth increase in the pandemic for founder CEOs of Amazon, $91 billion, Walmart, $38 billion, Google, $37 billion, Microsoft, $33 billion, Facebook, $28 billion, Nike, $8 billion, Apple, $8 billion. Small businesses collectively lost over $200 billion. We're witnessing a record wealth transfer. Indeed. And that's centrally what the Great Reset is all about. Now imagine if Ireland's Leo Varadkar, when he was Taoiseach back in March, had given a speech to the people that went a little something like this. Listen guys, I'm afraid you're going to have to shut down your businesses forever. There's a virus and it's going to be here for ages. The whole world is going to be thrown into one crisis after another. Nothing we can do, guys. The rest of your life is just going to be unending misery and upheaval. New normal on the way. Sorry about that. Say goodbye to your livelihoods and social lives. The SME sector is finished. Prepare for mandatory face masks forever in order to be able to just go into the shops or go on public transport. Also, there's this thing called social distancing where people treat each other like pariahs. Basically, it's the presumption of being an asymptomatic carrier of a deadly contagious disease. So stay apart. And also, we're going to be essentially undermining your property rights and right to the sanctity of your homes by being able to enact legislation on how many people are permitted in your home. We're going to cancel religious services and holidays, and in the long run, there's going to be mandatory vaccinations, guys, with digital immunity passports, which is an app on your phone that shows if you're vaccinated, or otherwise, you won't be able to go about your life or leave your home. Big corporations are going to make a fortune, and more power and wealth will be transferred from you plebs to the 1% of the 1%. Small businesses are finished. Shut them down. That's an order. Don't make us send in the guards. But you see, you can never be quite so honest with people in the beginning when you're trying to alter human behavior. It takes time, and the conditioning is very gradual, very subtle. If small business owners, for example, were told in the beginning that they would have to shut down forever, there would have obviously been huge backlash, and people would have twigged that something was very seriously wrong. They would want proof that they were living in an actual pandemic beyond some scary graphs on a television. So Varadkar, like any other political puppet, has to follow a similar plan that's been given to him. The public and small businesses weren't initially told that the virus was going to be a problem for a very long time. They were told that it was just a few weeks to flatten the curve in order to avoid the terrible grim reality of a worst case scenario of 85,000 deaths in Ireland by COVID. That's what he suggested back in March. It seems absurd to read this headline again now in November. Anyway, the frog in the pot has to be boiled slowly, or otherwise it won't have time to adapt to the increase in temperature and it will jump out of the water. So to keep people under control, they have to be gradually primed for the new abnormal world with promises about how it's all going to eventually end and go back to normal in just a few weeks. The behavior modification narrative has to ever so slightly be tweaked periodically so as to be almost imperceptible by the general public. 2 weeks to flatten the curve becomes, it's just a few more weeks to stop the hospitals from being overrun. Then it's the next 2 weeks are crucial. And then it's we have to get the R number down. And then it's experts are concerned about worrying spikes or something. And then it's just a few more months. And then it's just until we get a vaccine. Eventually it'll be, it's just until the next vaccine, and then the next one after that, and so on and so on. Mandatory masks and social distancing signs and stickers were initially suggested as being only temporary, until, of course, a sufficient amount of time has passed, and the general public have been so utterly broken and demoralized that they adapt to these things as part of their daily routine. Then they become the new normal. From the government's perspective, there's no need to definitively come out and say when these policies will ever go away, because if the public are so compliant, Why would the government surrender their new powers? The increased draconian airport security measures after 9/11 weren't temporary, though many people thought they were at the time. So why should any government relinquish these new COVID control measures? What I couldn't get through to people back in March and April is that when people surrender some of their rights, governments don't voluntarily give them back. And that has been a clear thing. That's been a clear pattern throughout history. Freedoms are trampled on and our lives are slowly changed, bit by bit. They rob the people of their liberties a piece at a time. And all, of course, under the guise of public safety. So anyway, a few months go by and sure enough, the hoodwinked, compliant public who've consumed constant fear propaganda from every conceivable angle, they're now wearing their masks like slaves of the past. They're even wearing them walking down the street, and they haven't been told to do that. They know to stand on the circles, follow the arrows, queue outside the supermarket, wear the masks, use the hand sanitizer, and keep their distance. The Pavlovian dog training is complete. They've now been placed into a state of such brainless docility that they are ready for more arbitrary instructions. The globalists knew that they had to get SMEs out of the way in order to create their wealth transfer to big businesses. So small business owners were told to hang in there, and eventually they were fed scraps of hope. A new reopening plan was unveiled, where restaurants, shops, hair salons, gyms and pubs, etc. would remodel and reorganize their premises and means of operating to comply with social distancing guidance. No doubt they were desperate to comply. Limits were placed on the number of people permitted into the premises. Plexiglass screens were installed. Face coverings or visors became commonplace. Time limits were put in place. Bookings and names and numbers had to be taken by pubs in order to comply with contact tracing. All of these things were nothing more than a charade. Obstacles to be put in place to obstruct and damage the businesses. Part of the slow boil process. Make small businesses think that the government wants them to survive and that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And the SMEs fell for it hook, line and sinker. The daft regulations that were meant to undermine their business models and reduce their profitability and slowly make them unworkable. The powers that be knew that if they didn't offer SMEs this false dawn of hope, that they would likely become fed up and revolt against the summer lockdown. The summer reopening was therefore simply all part of the narcissistic strategy of love bombing after an abandonment phase. It was about trying to keep the SMEs sweet. False hopes of returning to normal would later be dashed by another second lockdown designed to finish off the SMEs and put them out of business for good. You cannot appease your oppressor. Complying with one mandate will inevitably lead to another, and then another and another, until your life is nothing like it was before, until your life is unrecognizable and you've lost all your freedoms and everything that meant anything to you. One of the biggest challenges we face in waking people up is their flat refusal to believe in the concept of evil, and that evil is very much at work in the world right now. But just like a viral transmission, evil needs a host to survive. Its power comes by spreading through fear and intimidation among a compliant public. If you refuse to comply, the power of evil disappears. Please stop complying.